Hey, hello. Hey, so I'm Brandon Maslen from the Microsoft Edge team, and I just want to have a quick discussion with everyone here about the storage access API. So, I've got a few slides here, some content to help us along, but if you want to dive deeper into anything, just pop your hand up or we can chat afterwards. So first, I wanted to talk a little bit about the motivation for why the storage access API. So first off, this helps enable a path to stricter by default settings. So the storage access API can help carve a hole in other settings such as block third-party cookies. So something that might broadly apply to all third-party content and break scenarios users care about. The storage access API actually allows sites to make a request and say, hey, I actually want access. And then based on the user settings, the embedder's permission model, it may actually be auto-granted or prompt the user. So aside from this, we also want to ensure interoperability. So this is actually something that Safari and Firefox have already shipped. So we want to make sure we're participating in that conversation, helping drive this towards standardization, and making sure the right things are being done in terms of prompting the user. And so quickly going over what the new surface area looks like, there's two new methods that are exposed on the document interface. So both of these are promise-based. The first one is has storage access, and then the second one is request storage access. Then there's also a new sandbox attribute. So if you have an iframe that's sandboxed, if you want to use these APIs, you have to specify allow storage access by user activation. And then kind of digging a little bit deeper into what each of these methods are, they're pretty simple, but the has storage access is basically a way for that embedded third-party content to say, hey, do I have access to storage right now? Based on the current user settings, if there's any existing storage access grants. And then the request storage access method is a way for that third-party content to request access. And what part of the request storage access does also require user activation or a user gesture. So, if you have an embedded content to your favorite social media or something like that, it doesn't have storage access. As soon as a user taps, clicks in that window, then that site can say, hey, I want to request storage access. We're going to send that request up to the frame, to the embedder. And then from that point, the embedder could say, hey, I want to grant an ephemeral or a temporary storage grant, or a more permanent one if something's happened, like actually prompting the user through the permissions model. And basically, now I want to talk about how does this interact with the existing storage system. And really, this actually interacts very similar to existing cookie blocks and cookie settings. So if you went to the page info or into settings and said, hey, I want to block cookies from foo.com, this is going to interact in the same way. So in the network service, as well as the browser process, right where the cookie access check is done, we're going to say, hey, are there any existing storage access grants? And if so, we might unblock access. But it won't actually override explicit blocks. So we will, if a user has said, I don't want cookies from foo.com, we're not going to unblock that. But if they have a more broad setting, like block third-party cookies or tracking prevention that Edge has, something like that, we would unblock access. And yeah, I think that's pretty much all I had for the prepared content. Nice and quick. The API is pretty simple. I've got a couple of links to the explainer, the I2I, and the design doc. So I was hoping we could dive deeper into questions about the API and how it affects Chromium.
So I'm curious, what happens, so I think today, if you go into Chrome settings while you have a site open and change the cookie settings for a page, the page just sort of suddenly loses access to its storage. Is there any room for something like the storage access API sort of making the sort of change to user settings a little bit more easy to handle for websites?
Potentially. It depends how that site's coded. If a site was saying, if they only checked once and said, hey, do I have storage access? They might be subject to the same pitfalls. Whereas if it was wrapped around every storage access, then potentially they could say, hey, I don't have access now. I want to request access.
Do we anticipate authors writing code that way, given it's a bit of an edge case?
It depends. I think the recommended use case is to actually wrap every storage call in either a has storage access or a request storage access. So that way you actually handle the error cases and you're not just in a stuck state where you have a script error or something like that.
I was gonna say maybe there's something around some eventing model if you did want to make it more natural. I'd imagine most sites will actually just have some upfront check, and once they have access, I assume they'll assume it keeps working. Probably still have the same site issue, I would guess.
Just on that point, I don't think there's any privacy benefit of ever removing storage access, right? Because you don't know what the page might have already read into the heap, and you're not going to like flush data from the heap. So I think your options are increase storage access, and then if you want to take something away, I think the only option really is to reload the page.
Yeah.
We just do weird things.
Yeah, that seems like a bug to me, right? I don't think there's any good reason to take away storage access from an already running page that has at least run any script.
I think he's referring to just how the actual content settings will update and propagate. And so, if that wasn't fixed, this would help mitigate that.
So the additional sandbox attribute, it's really hard to ship additional sandbox attributes because you have to go back and change like pages that already exist. Mm-hmm. And then you have a coordination problem because you got to get the pages to opt into the new storage access. Have you done any analysis there in terms of the pain?
No, not with that. Some of the API surface area was actually set by Safari, who coined the API. So we're kind of following suit and saying, hey, we want to ship this interoperable with what both Safari and Firefox have shipped. So we want to.
I was just asking, any differences in the implementation?
There are a few differences. So even between Firefox and Apple, there's various differences between how long the storage access lasts, as well as how frequently the user might be prompted. So for example, Firefox will keep the grant for up to 30 days or 24 hours, depending on the type, whereas Apple will lose that grant every page load. So we've opted more towards the Firefox model, just because it's a little bit better for users where, hey, you've requested access, you've shown this intent for it. Next time you load that page, we don't want users to have to be like, hey, yeah, I actually want to unblock that again.
Maybe this has changed, but I thought there was another difference between Mozilla and Apple in that Mozilla was blocking storage until access was granted, and Apple has double keying storage. And then they were only switching cookie access, but not the rest of quota storage over, which seems dangerous to me because then you can now join things across that boundary. But I was curious which model there you were following, the Mozilla model or?
Yeah, again, similar to the Mozilla, where we would unblock all storage access, so block it, and then unblock it once you get access. We have talked to Apple, and they are willing to unblock other storage. It's just less important for them because they do the double keying.
Are they blocking now?
I thought Mozilla convinced them to change. I seem to remember the same thing. I don't know whether. Well, Rick said that he thought that that Apple was abandoning the double keying, and I think I remember hearing something similar. What wasn't clear to me is whether that has shipped yet or just announced. I think Rick is looking it up on his phone.
Total implementation detail thing here. So excited that you're working in this code because there's some really old crufty stuff. The way the individual storage type APIs check for access ends up going through very convoluted paths, including sync IPC in many cases, and therefore also including in some cases caching the results. So there's a lot of opportunity for cleanup and improvements as you go through this. So looking forward to the CLs.
Oh, good to hear. Thanks.
So maybe I missed it, but what does it look like to the user?
Yeah, so there's two models. So as soon as the user clicks in that iframe and says, and the embedded content requests storage access, it could be silent. So there's a little bit of logic where we may automatically grant an ephemeral storage access, in which case the storage would just be unblocked and it would work. If a certain threshold's hit, so say you see the same third-party content across a number of unique top-level origins and top-level documents, you may actually see a permissions prompt saying, hey, embedded content wants to request storage access on top-level site. Do you want to allow or deny?
Okay. What's interesting, I'm not sure whether a user would understand what storage access means or what the implications of that are, but.
Yeah, so I think with our intent to implement our what's it called now? Intent to prototype. So we'll just pretend that got rebranded. I don't think there's any agreement right now that Chrome would ship this. I think we're trying to get a consistent API surface available in Chromium, and I think the Chrome team at some point can, with us, consider exposing this as well. I think it'd be great to have consistent API surface, and even if a browser chose not to have permissions UX, the API could still make some sense in terms of just letting people code to one API. But I think we've seen with notifications prompts, like there is concerns around a lot of prompting. But if you use Safari, like you will see these prompts, and it's looks like a lot like a normal permission prompt. It says, danger, danger, your privacy might be impacted. You want to allow it anyway. So I think we still have questions on our end on like how often do we prompt? What's the message we show? Do we want to have some things auto approve? Maybe we need to go even more creative with like, let's have a service that knows what's good and what actually needs to permission prompts. We don't know yet. Kind of want to get this in first so we can then build the UX and see what makes sense.
So speaking of prompting, my understanding is that the current API doesn't allow the developer any control over whether a prompt occurs. Like, what are your thoughts on like whether it would be useful for authors to be able to say, well, I'd like to request storage access if it's not going to bother the user, but if the browser isn't willing to let me have that, I'm willing to just let things lie. Like there might be cases where they could potentially slightly improve the experience with storage access, but that improvement would not be so great that they want users to be like bothered with another prompt popping up.
I think the current use case for that is more if you check like has storage access and it returns false, you just say, my use case isn't super useful. I wouldn't request it. I think the assumption should be made that it could prompt, and it's really up to the host to make that determination.
We sort of indicated that there are a number of cases where it would have been auto approved, and where it turns out there wouldn't have been any cost like to the user for the developer making that call, but the developer seems to have to try and guess whether it's going to get that auto approval or not.
So it's something we haven't looked in too deeply. Right now, we've kind of been focused on, hey, we want to get parity with the other implementations. It is an interesting thing to look into, though.
Yeah, and I guess on that point, we're going to try to figure out how do we get this more spec'd and standardized. I think it'd be great if folks from Google have other ideas about how to improve it. I think that'd be awesome to have participation.
So on that question about the API in Chromium, right? I mean, Mike West has been involved in the API design, right? I don't think the API itself is terribly contentious, right? I think Mike had a few different ideas, but I think we've agreed that, it's already in two engines. We should just, the API, all the contentious bits are policy, right? And, different browsers should be making different policy choices. So I don't expect it to be terribly contentious to, I can't say what Chrome's going to ship or not ship, but getting this API into Chromium with an expectation that all Chromium browsers will expose the API surface area makes sense. I can definitely see the differences in policy might influence the API design. I can totally see why it would make sense to have a request only if it will be approved kind of mode. Because, it's not, you don't want to, because we don't want to just suddenly grant storage. You wouldn't want has storage access to suddenly grant it, because you want the developer to reason about when their storage they have access to is changed, right? So, for example, you could imagine cases where the user agent might decide to grant storage access on a user gesture, right? And in that case, you'd want has storage access to return false. But if request storage access is called within the context of a user gesture, then you'd want to grant it. But depending on the use case. And then the other thing was to answer the previous question, it was ITP 2.1 back in iOS 12.2 eliminated partitioned cookies. So it's just a single set of cookies per state.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, cookies was the only thing that was partitioned, I thought.
Yes, and that is what is really weird. No, they I've always partitioned their quota storage, but Storage Access API only switched cookies, but none of the other storage APIs in Safari. No, they weren't. They were partitioned, and Mozilla proposed blocking them. Yeah, that's what is to me personally has been very strange about the Apple implementation. Maybe I'm completely confused, but like Mozilla folks agreed, and they're like, "Well, that's why we're blocking, because you don't want to like switch part of your storage. Now you can join with the other part that wasn't switched, and exfiltrate data." So like, yeah, I encourage us to follow the Mozilla model on this one.
Yeah, and definitely we want to make sure we unblock things uniformly. Even in our past Spartan engine, we've seen, hey, if you selectively unblock storage or block it, you get weird site bugs where they think, hey, I have access and I don't, or I don't and I do. Yeah.
As with Josh, is probably in too much of a nitty-gritty implementation detail, but for some of the storage APIs like cookies, it sort of makes sense to introduce new errors, and that's like wrapping things in has storage access makes sense. For the sort of more advanced storage APIs like index.db, I assume that we can probably merge the new blocking related errors into the existing streams so that we don't have you don't have to wrap, like the idea of wrapping every single storage API call and has storage access seems like that's just a recipe for bugs.
Yeah, this API is mostly about the unblocking. So I think as we get to those new settings or new ways to block things, that's something that could be evaluated. Was there anything else people wanted to dig into?
Sorry, I came in late, so maybe you said this, but what's your time frame look like?
We've actually already started implementing it in Chromium. We're just working on hashing out a few details on the permissions model with the your browser experience team. So you should look for more PRs in the next upcoming weeks.
But as far as shipping a feature in Edge?
Yeah, I think once it's in and we've received that code, we're going to start experimenting with that, and then experimenting with the UX and see what makes sense.
Sort of connected to a point that Rick made earlier, it seems like this API is supported a lot across a lot of browsers, and so supporting at least the API makes sense. Do you think it makes sense for Edge or Chrome or whatever to ship this API even in advance of implementing a model like Safari's or Firefox's, even if that is like has storage access is like return true, or like is that useful?
So could you clarify? Like, do you mean just shipping it before?
So there's the question of is the API web exposed, and there's the question of what is the browser's policy to deciding whether storage access should be granted. Do you think those two things should necessarily be tied, or do you intend to tie them, or do you think that exposing today's policies through the existing storage access API and then possibly later on changing those policies to be more privacy sensitive or whatever is reasonable?
Yeah, I think our intent is to do experimentation, see what makes sense for our users, and then help influence the standardization of that.
But to that question, we have features like the third-party click thing.
Yeah.
Would it make sense to start there versus more elaborate?
Yeah, so our intent is also to tie into that block third-party cookie settings.
Perfect. That was exactly my question.
Yeah.
Seems like the API makes perfect sense with third-party cookie blocking that already exists in all browsers. So.
Yeah, and that's actually called out in the explainer too. That says, hey, this is something that already exists. That with this API, hopefully users may adopt that more.
What do you think?
I mean, I think I'm not a decision maker on this, But I mean, my personal opinion is that I think it does make sense to expose this API to expose the existing policy that browsers have. And I think my only fear of that would have been that people sort of ossify on what our policies are today. But I think that the fact that other browser vendors are already shipping a variety of policies behind that API probably makes that not a big risk. And so I think that it makes it easy, like us exposing the API makes it easier for developers to write against that API today. And so I think it's reasonable to ship that API separately from policy changes.
So yeah, I think we'll consider, and we'll look forward to Blink Dev conversations, I guess. So thanks.
I'm not an API owner.
Cool. Anything else? All right. I think we're done a little bit early here. Thanks, everyone.